Hello, hello, hello. Hey, hey, hey. I hope you're having a great day. If you're new here or we haven't met yet, I'm Hannah, aka the Paperback Bruncher, here on YouTube, BookTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Lemonade. And I just post about books on all channels of the internet. If there's somewhere I can talk about books and find book lovers, I'm probably going to be there. I am trying out some new things. BookTube is my newest platform, my newest channel. So I am working on growing and trying new things. And one of those things is doing more live streams. So one of my current live stream series as of now, because it's video number 2, is reading to you one of my favorite books, which you can see back here. I collect. There's actually 2 shelves. If I tilt my camera just a little bit more, you can see them up here. That shelf and this shelf are copies of Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. So it's a children's classic that I grew up with that really just made me fall in love with reading and fall in love with words and inspired me just to be, I guess, a stronger woman, even though she's a girl. But I felt like she's so unapologetically herself. She's so wordy. She's so happy. She's so uniquely herself that I was always inspired by Anne as a kid and still am as an adult. And I think it absolutely holds up. So I wanted to revisit the series with all of you, work on, I guess, kind of my public speaking in a sense, because I'm reading aloud to you. So I get to kind of practice and brush up those skills and work on reading aloud and my presentation skills while hanging out with you and sharing the love of one of my favorite books. If you haven't watched it yet, we already read the first 3 chapters of the book. So if you go down in the video description down below, you'll see those first 3 chapters are linked down below in the first video. And for chapter 2, or video 2, we'll be reading chapters 4, 5, and 6. Sorry, words are hard. We'll get there. We're warming up. We'll be reading about 3 chapters at a time as we move along, and I get a little bit less rusty with it. Hopefully, maybe we'll read a bit more at a time, and I'm going to try to make it a weekly series until we finish. So whether you're watching the replays or you're watching live, I'm just happy to have you here and happy to share my love of Anne with you. So pop in the chat if you are watching live. I would love to say hello to you, and we'll get started in a second here. All right. Also, as of right now, as of me filming, it is technically Valentine's Day. So I wore a very cute little rose skirt today because I love a theme. So last time I wore my Anne shirt in an outfit I thought Anne would like. Today we're going a little bit more Valentine's. Let's see what we'll do next time. All right. Here's my copy that I'll be reading from. It's somewhat illustrated, so when I do get to any illustrations within the book, I will also be showing you those illustrations because they're too beautiful to keep those to myself. All right. It is time. And also, quick reminder, if you're looking for more of a bookish connection, I do host a free virtual book club. It's called the Moody Readers Book Club. Every single month, we read a new mood. So it's always different genres, all sorts of different books. For February, you can see our book club pick right here. It's 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. It's very on brand for Valentine's Day. Tis the season of love. So that's what we'll be reading. We have our Zoom schedule planned already. Like I said, every single month is a new mood. We would love to have you if you're available and free. All right, so we are starting today with chapter 4 for those of you who want to grab your own book and follow along as well. I know I love an immersive read, and this chapter is called Morning at Green Gables. And we've got Kim joining us again. Hi, Kim. Getting ready for bed. I love the time difference. It's bright and sunny here, and you're getting ready for bed. Reading your bedtime story. Aw, good practice for me. All right. Morning at Green Gables. Let's see if I remember the voices. Those might take me a little bit of time to tap back into. It was broad daylight when Anna woke and sat up in bed, staring confusedly at the window through which a flood of cheery sunshine was pouring, and outside of which something white and feathery waved across glimpses of blue sky. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. First came a delightful thrill, as of something very pleasant, and then a horrible remembrance. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. But it was morning, and yes, it was a cherry tree in full bloom outside of her window. With a bound, she was out of bed and across the floor. She pushed up the sash. It went up stiffly and creakily as if it hadn't been opened for a long time, which was the case, and it stuck so tight and nothing was needed to hold it up. Anne dropped on her knees and gazed out into the June morning, her eyes glistening with delight. Oh, wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it a lovely place? Suppose she wasn't really going to stay here. She would imagine she was. There was scope for imagination here. A huge cherry tree grew outside, so close that its boughs tapped against the house, and it was so thick set with blossoms that hardly a leaf was to be seen. On both sides of the house was a big orchard, one of apple trees and one of cherry trees, also showered with blossoms, and their grass was sprinkled with dandelions. In the garden below were lilac trees purple with flowers, and their dizzily sweet fragrance drifted up to the window on the morning wind. Below the garden, a green field lush with clover sloped down the hollow where the brook ran and where scores of white birches grew, upspringing airily out of an undergrowth suggestive of delightful possibilities in ferns and mosses and woodsy things generally. Beyond it was a hill, green and feathery with spruce and fir. There was a gap in it where the gray gable end of the little house she had seen from the other side of the lake of shining waters was visible. Off to the left were the big barns, and beyond them, away down over the green, low-sloping fields, was a sparkling blue glimpse of sea. Anne's beauty-loving eyes lingered on it all, taking everything greedily in. She had looked on so many unlovely places in her life, poor child, but this was as lovely as anything she had ever dreamed. She knelt there, last to everything but the loveliness around her, until she was startled by a hand on her shoulder. Marilla had come in unheard by the small dreamer. "It's time you were dressed," she said curtly. Marilla did not really know how to talk to the child, and her uncomfortable ignorance made her crisp and curt when she did not mean to be. Anne stood up and drew a long breath. "Oh, isn't it wonderful?" she said, waving her hand comprehensively at the good world outside. "It's a big tree," said Marilla, "and it blooms great, but the fruit don't match to much never, small and wormy." "Oh, I don't mean just the tree. Of course it's lovely. Yes, it's radiantly lovely. It blooms as if it meant it, but I meant everything. The garden, the orchard, and the brook, and the woods, the whole big dear world. Don't you feel as if you had just loved the world on a morning like this? And I can hear the brook laughing all the way up here. Have you ever noticed what cheerful things brooks are? They're always laughing. Even in winter time, I've heard them under the ice. I'm so glad there's a brook near Green Gables. Perhaps you don't think it makes any difference to me when you're not going to keep me, but it does. I shall always like to remember that there is a brook at Green Gables, even if I never see it again. If there wasn't a brook, I'd be haunted by the uncomfortable feeling that there ought to be one. I'm not in the depths of despair this morning. I can never be in the morning. Isn't it a splendid thing that there are mornings? But I feel very sad. I've just been imagining that it was really me you wanted after all, and that I was to stay here forever and ever. It was a great comfort while it lasted, but the worst of imagining things is that when the time comes, you have to stop, and that hurts." "You'd better get dressed and come downstairs and never mind your imaginings," said Marilla, as soon as she could get a word in edgewise. "Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face, comb your hair, leave the window up, and turn your bedclothes back over the foot of the bed. Be as smart as you can." Anne could evidently be smart to some purpose, for she was downstairs in 10 minutes' time, with her clothes neatly on, her hair brushed and braided, her face washed, and a comfortable consciousness pervading her soul that she had fulfilled all of Marilla's requirements. As a matter of fact, however, She had forgotten to turn back the bedclothes. I'm pretty hungry this morning, she announced as she slipped into the chair Marilla placed for her. The world doesn't seem such a howling wilderness as it did last night. I'm so glad it was a sunshiny morning, but I like rainy mornings real well too. All sorts of mornings are interesting, don't you think? You don't know what's going to happen through the day, and there's so much scope for imagination. But I'm glad it's not rainy today because it's easier to be cheerful and bear up under affliction on a sunshiny day. I feel that I have a good deal to bear up under. It's all very well to read about sorrows and imagine yourself living through them heroically, but it's not so nice when you really come to have them, is it? For pity's sake, hold your tongue, said Marilla. You talk entirely too much for a little girl. Thereupon, Anne held her tongue so obediently and thoroughly that her continued silence made Marilla rather nervous, as if in the presence of something not exactly natural. Matthew also held his tongue, but this was natural. So the meal was a very silent one. As it progressed, Anne became more and more abstracted, eating mechanically, with her big eyes fixed unswervingly and unseeingly on the sky outside the window. This made Marilla more nervous than ever. She had an uncomfortable feeling that while this odd child's body might be there at the table, her spirit was far away in some remote, airy cloudland, borne aloft on the wings of imagination. Who would want such a child about the place? Yet Matthew had wished to keep her of all accountable things. Marilla felt that he had wanted just as much this morning as he had the night before, and that he would go on wanting it. That was Matthew's way. Take a whim into his head and cling to it with the most amazing silent persistency, a persistency 10 times more potent and effectual in its very silence than if he had talked it out. When the meal was ended, Anne came out of her reverie and offered to wash the dishes. Can you wash dishes right? Asked Marilla distressfully. Pretty well. I'm better at looking after children, though. I've had so much experience at that. It's such a pity you haven't any here for me to look after. I don't feel as if I wanted any more children to look after than I've got at present. You're problem enough in all conscience. What's to be done with you, I don't know. Matthew is a most ridiculous man. I think he's lovely, said Anne reproachfully. He is so very sympathetic. He didn't mind how much I talked. He seemed to like it. I felt that he was a kindred spirit as soon as I ever saw him. You're both queer enough, if that's what you mean by kindred spirits, said Marilla, with a sniff. Yes, you may wash the dishes, take plenty of hot water, and be sure you dry them well. I've got enough to attend to this morning, for I'll have to drive to White Sands in the afternoon and see Mrs. Spencer. You'll come with me and we'll settle what's to be done with you. After you finish the dishes, go upstairs and make your bed. Anne washed the dishes deftly enough, as Marilla, who kept a sharp eye on the process, discerned. Later on, she made her bed less successfully, for she had never learned the art of wrestling with a feather stick. But it was done somehow and smoothed down, and then Marilla, to get rid of her, told her she might go out of doors and amuse herself until dinner time. Anne flew to the door, face alight, eyes glowing. On the very threshold she stopped short, wheeled about, came back, and sat down by the table, light and glow as effectually blotted out as if someone had clapped an extinguisher on her. What's the matter now? Demanded Marilla. I don't dare go out, said Anne in a tone of a martyr relinquishing all earthly joys. If I can't stay here, there's no use in my loving Green Gables. And if I go out there and get acquainted with all those trees and flowers and the orchard and the brook, I'll not be able to help loving it. It's hard enough now, so I won't make it any harder. I want to go out so much. Everything seems to be calling to me. Anne, come out to us. Anne, we want to playmate. But it's better not. There's no use in loving things if you have to be torn from them, is there? And it's so hard to keep from loving things, isn't it? That's why I was so glad when I thought I was going to live here. I thought I would have so many things to love and nothing to hinder me, but that brief dream is over. I'm resigned to my fate now, and I don't think I'll go out for fear I'll get unresigned again. What is the name of that geranium on the windowsill, please? That's the apple-scented geranium. Oh, I don't mean that sort of name. I mean just a name you gave it yourself. Didn't you give it a name? May I give it one then? May I call it, let me see. Bonnie would do. May I call it Bonnie while I'm here? Oh, do let me. Goodness, I don't care. But where on earth is a sense of naming a geranium? Oh, I like to have things have handles, even if they are only geraniums. It makes them seem more like people. How do you know but that it hurts a geranium's feelings just to be called a geranium and nothing else? You wouldn't like to be called nothing but a woman all the time. Yes, I shall call it Bonnie. I named that cherry tree outside my bedroom window this morning. I called it Snow Queen because it was so white. Of course, it won't always be in blossom, but one can imagine that it is. Can't one? I've never in all my life saw or heard anything equal to her, muttered Marilla, beating a retreat down to the cellar after potatoes. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I can feel already that I'm wondering what on earth she'll say next. She'll be casting a spell over me, too. She's cast it over Matthew. That look he gave me when he went out said everything he said or hinted last night over again. I wish he was like other men and would talk things out. A body could answer back then and argue him into reason. But what's to be done with a man who just looks? Anne had relapsed into reverie, with her chin in her hands and her eyes on the sky, when Marilla returned from her cellar pilgrimage. There, Marilla left her until the early dinner was on the table. I suppose I can have the mare and buggy this afternoon, Matthew, said Marilla. Matthew nodded and looked wistfully at Anne. Marilla intercepted the look and said grimly, I'm going to drive over to White Sands and settle this thing. I'll take Anne with me, and Mrs. Spencer will probably make arrangements to send her back to Nova Scotia at once. I'll set your tea out for you, and I'll be home in time to milk the cows. Still, Matthew said nothing, and Marilla had a sense of having wasted words and breath. There is nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back, unless it's a woman who won't. Matthew hitched the sorrel into the buggy in due time, and Marilla and Anne set off. Matthew opened the yard gate for them, and as they drove slowly through, he said nothing to nobody in particular, as it seemed. Little Cherry Bout from the creek was here this morning, and I told him I guessed I'd hire him for the summer. Marilla made no reply, but she had hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the road at an alarming pace. Marilla looked back as the buggy bounced along and saw the aggravating Matthew leaning over the gate, looking wistfully. Chapter 5, Anne's History. Let me grab a quick sip of water here. Also, hello. Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for popping in. Let me grab my water real quick. 1 sec. It's right here. Let's see. Good. Right. And we've got a picture as well to show at this part. All right, back at it. Chapter 5, Anne's History. Cute. Do you know, said Anne confidently, I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive. It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly. I am not going to think about going back to the asylum while we're having our drive. I'm just going to think about the drive. Oh, look, there's one little early wild rose out. Isn't it lovely? Don't you think it must be glad to be a rose? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? I'm sure they would tell us such lovely things. And isn't pink the most bewitching color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Red-headed people can't wear pink, not even in imagination. Did you ever know of anybody whose hair was red when she was young, but got to be another color when she grew up? No, I don't know that I ever did, said Marilla mercilessly, and I shouldn't think it likely to happen in your case either. Anne sighed. Well, that's another hope gone. My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. That's a sentence I read in a book once, and I say it over to comfort myself whenever I'm disappointed in anything. I don't see where comforting comes in myself, said Marilla. Why, because it sounds so nice and romantic, just as if I was a heroine in a book, you know. I'm so fond of romantic things, and a graveyard full of buried hopes is about as romantic as thing as one could imagine, isn't it? I'm rather glad I have one. Are we going across the Lake of Shining Waters today? We're not going over Barry's Pond, if that's what you mean by your Lake of Shining Waters. We're going by the shore road. Shore road sounds nice, said Anne dreamily. Is it as nice as it sounds? Just when you said shore road, I saw it in a picture in my mind as quick as that. And White Sands is a pretty name too, but I don't like it as well as Avonlea. Avonlea is a lovely name. It sounds like music. How far is White Sands? It's 5 miles, and as you're evidently bent on talking, you might as well talk to some purpose by telling me what you know about yourself. Oh, what I know about myself isn't really worth telling, said Anne eagerly. If you'll only let me tell you what I imagine about myself, you'll think it ever so much more interesting. No, I don't want any of your imaginings. Just you stick to bald facts. Begin at the beginning. Where were you born and how old are you? I was 11 last March, said Anne, resigning herself to bald facts with a little sigh. And I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley. He was a teacher in the Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had nice names. It would be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say, Jedediah, wouldn't it? I guess it doesn't really matter what a person's name is as long as he behaves himself, said Marilla, feeling herself called upon to inoculate a good and useful moral. Well, I don't know. Anne looked thoughtful. I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't believe a rose would be as nice as if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. I suppose my father could have been a good man even if he had been called Jedediah, but I'm sure it would have been a cross. Well, my mother was a teacher in the high school too, but when she married my father, she gave up teaching, of course. A husband was enough responsibility. Mrs. Thomas said that there was a pair of babies and as poor as church mice. They went to live in a weeny teeny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it thousands of times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor window and lilacs in the front yard and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. Mrs. Thomas said I was the homeliest baby she ever saw. I was so scrawny and tiny and nothing but eyes, but that a mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. I should think a mother would be a better judge than a poor woman who came in to scrub, wouldn't you? I'm glad she was satisfied with me anyhow. I would feel so sad if I thought I was a disappointment to her, because she didn't live very long after that, you see. She died of fever when I was just 3 months old. I do wish she lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. I think it would be so sweet to say, Mother, don't you? And Father died 4 days afterwards from fever too. That left me an orphan, and folks were at their wits' end. So Mrs. Thomas said what to do with me. You see, nobody wanted me even then. It seems to be my fate. Father and mother had both come from places far away, and it was well known that they hadn't any relatives living. Finally, Mrs. Thomas said she'd take me, though she was poor and had a drunken husband, and she brought me up by hand. Do you know if there's anything in being brought up by hand that ought to make people who are brought up that way better than other people? Because whenever I was naughty, Mrs. Thomas would ask me how I could be such a bad girl when she had brought me up by hand, reproachful like. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I helped them look after the Thomas children. There were four of them younger than me, and I could tell you that they took a lot of looking after. Then Mr. Thomas was killed falling under a train, and his mother offered to take Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me. Mrs. Thomas was at her wits' end, so she said, what to do with me. Then Mrs. Hammond from up the river came and said she'll take me, seeing I was handy with children, and I went up the river to live with her in a little clearing among the stumps. It was a very lonesome place. I'm sure I could have never lived there if I hadn't had an imagination. Mr. Hammond worked a little sawmill up there, and Mrs. Hammond had 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair came. I used to get so dreadfully tired carrying them about. I lived up the river with Mrs. Hammond over 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died, and Mrs. Hammond broke up housekeeping. She divided her children among her relatives and went to the States. I had to go to the asylum at Hopetown because nobody would take me. They didn't want me at the asylum either. They said they were overcrowded as it was, but they had to take me, and I was there for 4 months until Mrs. Spencer came. Anne finished up with another sigh, of relief this time. Evidently, she did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. Did you ever go to school? Demanded Marilla, turning the sorrel mare down the shore road. Not a great deal. I went a little the year I stayed with Mrs. Thomas. When I went upriver, we were so far from school that I couldn't walk it in winter, and there was a vacation in summer, so I could only go in the spring and fall. But, of course, I went while I was at the asylum. I can read pretty well, and I know ever so many pieces of poetry off by heart. The Battle of Hollenden and Edinburgh, after Flodden and Bingen on the Rhine, and lots of The Lady of the Lake, and most of the Seasons by James Thompson. Don't you just love poetry that gives you a crinkly feeling up and down your back? There's a piece in the Fifth Rider, The Downfall of Poland, that is just full of thrills. Of course, I wasn't in the 5th reader. I was only in the 4th, but the big girls used to lend me theirs to read. Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you? Asked Marilla, looking at Anne out of the corner of her eye. Oh, faltered Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. Oh, they had meant to be. I know they just meant to be as good and kind as possible. But when people mean to be good to you, you don't mind very much when they're not quite always. They had a good deal to worry them, you know. It's very trying to have a drunken husband, you see, and it must be very trying to have twins 3 times in succession, don't you think? But I feel sure that they meant to be good to me. Marilla asked no more questions. Anne gave herself up to a silent rapture over the shore road, and Marilla guided the sorrel abstractedly while she pondered deeply. Pity was suddenly stirring in her heart for the child. What a starved, unloved life she had had, a life of drudgery and poverty and neglect, for Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. No wonder she had been so delighted at the prospect of a real home. It was a pity she had to be sent back. What if she, Marilla, should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He was set on it, and the child seemed a nice, teachable little thing. She's got too much to say, thought Marilla. But she might be trained out of that, and there's nothing rude or slangy in what she does say. She is ladylike. It's likely her people were nice folks. The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the gulf winds, grew thickly. On the left were the steep red sandstone cliffs, so near the track in places that a mare of less steadiness than the sorrel might have tried the nerves of the people behind her. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks or little sandy coves inlaid with pebbles as with ocean jewels. Beyond lay the sea, shimmering in blue, and over it soared the gulls, their pinions flashing silvery in the sunlight. "Isn't the sea wonderful?" said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. "Once, when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day, even if I had to look after the children all the time. I lived it over in a happy dream for years. But this shore is nicer than the Marysville shore. Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull? I think I would. That is, if I couldn't be a human girl. Don't you think it would be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down the water and away out over that lovely blue all day, and then at night to fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it. What a big house is that just ahead, please?" "That's the White Sands Hotel. Mr. Kirk runs it, but the season hasn't begun yet. There are heaps of Americans come out there for the summer. They think the shore is just about right." "I was afraid it might be Mrs. Spencer's place," said Anne mournfully. "I don't want to get there. Somehow, it seems like it will be the end of everything." Chapter 6. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. So this will be our last chapter of the day, but I will be reading more again next week. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. "Dear, dear," she exclaimed, "you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in? And how are you, Anne?" "I'm as well as can be expected, thank you," said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. "I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare," said Marilla. "But I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, and there's been a queer mistake somehow, that I've come over to see what it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you that we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so," said Mrs. Spencer in distress. "Why, Robert sent word down by his daughter Nancy that said you wanted a girl, didn't she, Flora Jane?" Appealing to her daughter, who had just come out to the steps. "She certainly did, Miss Cuthbert," corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. "I'm dreadful sorry," said Mrs. Spencer. "It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for her heedlessness." "It was her own fault," said Marissa resignedly. "We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do is set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they?" Got a picture too. We've got Marilla and Anne sitting in the chair. Look at Anne's little face. Oh, precious. "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, "but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she had been sent by me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential." Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew that Mrs. Peter Blewett only by a sight of a small, shrewish-faced woman without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones, but she had heard of her. A terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her tender mercies. "Well, I'll go in and I'll talk the matter over, she said. And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute, exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall to the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them, as if the air had been strained so long through the dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth that it had ever possessed. That is real lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert, and you sit here on the ottoman and don't wriggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was that you happened along. Let me introduce you two ladies. Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven. Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne sat mutedly on the ottoman, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given to the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid that she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, and spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett, she said. I was under the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert had wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so. But it seems it was a boy they wanted, so if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you. Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. How old are you, and what's your name? She demanded. Anne Shirley, faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof. And I'm 11 years old. You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry. I don't know, but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, I'll take you. You'll have to be a good girl, you know, good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might take her as well off her hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her home right now. Marilla looked at Anne and softened at the sight of the child's pale face and with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught up in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman. No, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. Well, I don't know, she said slowly. I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I might say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think it's better to take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel I ought to have decided anything without consulting him. For if we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring her or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett? I suppose it'll have to, said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First, the look of despair faded out, and then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured, and a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables? She said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. Did you really say it, or did I imagine that you did? I think you had better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't, said Marilla crossly. Yes, you did hear me say that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you much more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go to live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back down and sit quietly and hold your tongue, and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to and be anything you want me, if only you'll keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla, from afar, had noted him prowling along and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when she saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," said Matthew, with an unusual vim. "I don't fancy her style myself," admitted Marilla, "but it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew. And since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it, but I'll do my best. So, as far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. "Well, now, I reckon you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla," he said. She's such an interesting little thing." "It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla. "But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor, so you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it'll be time enough to put your oar in." "There, Marilla, you can have your way," said Matthew reassuringly. "Only be as good and kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if only you get her to love you." Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinion concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. "I won't tell her tonight she can stay," she reflected as she strained the milk into the creamers. "She'd be so excited she wouldn't even sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprisingly enough, but not so surprisingly, as Matthew should be at the bottom of it. Him that always seemed to have such a mournful dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it." The end of today. So we'll start next week on chapter 7, which is called Anne Says Her Prayers. And in my book, that's page 46. So it should be something similar, perhaps, in your book if you're reading along. But like I said, we'll be reading weekly out of this book here. So maybe 3-4 chapters at a time. I think we'll start upping it next week to 4 chapters so that we're reading just a tad longer, because I want to be reading about an hour each time is kind of the goal. So we'll play it by ear, but I don't want it to take too long. And obviously we've only begun to crack into the story here. So that way we can breeze ahead, and maybe we'll even get up to twice a week. That being said, if you're new here, make sure to tap like on this video. If you like this series, let me know if there's any other series you would like me to read aloud for. This one, of course, is one that's in the public domain, so hopefully it's a little bit safer to be reading aloud for. But also don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've got a lot of fun content coming up. I recently went on a trip to Los Angeles, and this upcoming weekend, I'm about to head to Atlanta for a romance book festival. So there's a lot of really cool content that's coming up soon that I can't wait to share with all of you. And of course, if you're subscribed, that's the best way just to make sure that you don't miss any of it. So thanks for hanging out with me today, friends. Hello, Elena. Thanks for hanging out, Kim. Enjoy your rest, sleep tight, and I will catch you in the next one. Hello, Max. And I appreciate you all. Thanks for hanging out today, friends. I'll catch you in the next video. Happy Valentine's Day.